Welcome to the review for the Intro to Drawing midterm exam. We're going to start with the cube. This is a 1-point perspective cube, so we're going to begin the drawing with a square. Everyone just draw a square. And then we're always going to think, we're going to be looking for angles that we can measure. So the main angle here that we're going to start with is this one. And that angle is about 60 degrees. So we're going to draw this about 60 degree slope. You know what 60 degrees looks like because we worked with those 60 degree triangles for a very long time. In fact, mine is probably not steep enough. Maybe a little steeper. This angle here is going to be slightly less steep, and you see how that's closer? It's bending down towards 45 degrees, and you might remember that the reason for that is because these two lines in 1-point perspective have to converge. Now, I don't expect you to show me on your page where they converge, but I expect you to show me that you understand that these converge. And this one over here is going to be even less steep than the other one because it's also converging to the same point as this one. So the first step here is a square. The second step is measuring your angles. The next step is to judge your foreshortening. And we're trying to guess, or estimate, I should say, the size difference between this surface, which we've already drawn here, and this one, which we haven't drawn. And I'm going to estimate that to be about 1/7. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's almost about 1/8, I would say, of this. You don't need to know the exact number, but I want it to be approximately right. So I'm going to put it about there. What a lot of you are going to want to do is make this much longer, like half as wide as this. That's what you did in the pre-assessment. But now you know enough to use some fractional thinking and to estimate. This is really only about 1/7 or 1/8 as wide as that. And once you find that point, you can easily draw the top surface like that. I just caught a little error in my angle. I'm going to change this if you don't mind, to make that angle just a little steeper, and that shows a little more of the top. So here's how we're going to check the work. I'm going to take a piece of scrap paper and make sure that this edge here is bigger than this edge back here. It doesn't have to be a lot bigger, but this has to be bigger than this. And likewise, this has to be bigger than this. And that's because the ones in back are farther away, and your drawing is going to demonstrate that you understand that they're farther away. You're also supposed to shadow map and shade this drawing. That's going to be super easy with a cube. We're just going to sketch this shadow shape on the ground, And we're going to do a first shading that covers this side and the shadow on the ground. And we don't need any other second shading on this. So again, the big idea here that I really do expect you to demonstrate understanding of is that if this is X and this is Y, X is bigger than Y, and that's simply because X is closer to us than Y. If this is X and this is Z, X is also bigger than Z, again because X is closer to us than Z. Okay, we're going to move to the second drawing, and that is the 2-point perspective cube. So the 2-point perspective cube is a little harder, but we're going to use the same basic approach. We're going to start with a vertical, and then we're going to be looking closely at these angles again. Notice that the angle on the left is about 30 degrees, this one, and the angle on the right is about 45 degrees. If you make these angles the same, you're going to be way off. So it might help you to make a little baseline here. Again, you know what 30 degrees looks like, and you know what 45 degrees looks like. So just make them longer than they need to be. And then you should know by now that this line is going to be almost as long as this one. If this is X, this one's going to be just slightly smaller than X because it's only a little bit foreshortened. So you can just sort of imagine X kind of swinging around, and then we're going to make it just a little shorter than that. It's not very foreshortened because it's just about facing us. And again, this angle, if this is 30, this is going to be slightly less than 30. And we can check our work again with scrap paper. I'm going to check and make sure that this X is bigger than Y. Not a lot bigger, it's just a little bigger, but that's all that matters. Now we're going to think about the side that is foreshortened is obviously on the right, and that is going to be, I would say this line on the right is about half as long as this line on the left. Would you agree with me? Maybe even a little less than half. So if I mark half of this and come over, that's about how much I end up with over here. If this is X and this is Y and this is Z, which one is the smallest? Anybody? Which one of these is smallest, X, Y, or Z?
Z.
Right, Peter. Why is Z the smallest?
Because Z is a soft one.
Yep, and it's also the furthest away. Can everyone pay attention to this? Only Peter knew that answer. So Z is the smallest because it's the furthest away from us. That's the big lesson of perspective. I don't know why it's taking some people a long time to grasp this, but when things are farther away, they are smaller. So X is closest, then Y, then Z. So make sure you make this angle low enough to create a Z that is smaller than your Y. And again, you can check your work with scrap paper. There's Z. Should be just a little smaller than Y. And finally, here's the way, watch carefully. This is what half of you are going to do on the exam, and you're going to lose points. you're going to put this corner and back way too high. Okay, so don't do that. Remember, these are converging to a point, and this has to go to that same point. So it has to be down here where it's going to converge with these other two orthogonals, and this one is converging to the same point as these, so it has to be down here. So when in doubt, just lower this corner, because the big idea here is that as these move to the left, they're getting closer together, and as these move to the right, they are getting closer together. I exaggerated that effect a little bit, but it's better to, on the exam, it's better to draw this point too low than too high. If you put it too high, you lose points. If it's too low, you don't. And finally, the shadow map, again, is pretty simple on here. We are going to block that in. Interestingly, this almost is another orthogonal. And then your shading is just going to be on this side. And first shading is really all you need on this one too. You can do a little second shading on the ground if you want. And that's the second drawing. The third drawing is a cylinder. If you're not keeping up, you can go back and work on these after the demonstration is over, assuming you're done with your self-portraits. So the big idea with the cylinder is, first of all, some fractional thinking to establish the proportions of the top. And I measured this earlier today. If this is 1, about how many is this? Thank you. Oh, I tried to pause it, and I didn't pause that sneeze out.
It was like 5 1/4.
5 1/4, you think? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's closer to 4. This verse, see, that's, can you see how this unit here is about the same as this unit here? So it's about a 1:4 ellipse. So try to draw that. You can draw it freehand and then check your work with scrap paper if you want. There's my unit. This should be 4 units going across. I probably need to bring my points out a little bit, like that. Please pay attention. These are basically all the cheat codes for the exam. If you know these things, you will do very well. I will not be unhappy to give everyone 100 on the exam. I don't curve it. Okay, here's the vertical. The vertical, notice that the vertical is about the same as the diameter of the top. So we're going to come down about that same length. And then, as you should remember, the big idea with the base is that the back of this ellipse is about here. We can tell because this shadow comes from here. And you'll notice that this height is much bigger than this height. And that's because this bottom ellipse is farther from our eye level. And that is on the rubric. You got to make sure this curve here is rounder than this curve here. And remember, every beginner wants to make cylinders like this with a round top and a flat bottom, and that's what most of you did at the pre-assessment. So you got to show me that you get that this is rounder here and this is a little less round here. After you do that, here's the shadow edge. Here's the shadow map of the cast shadow. This is also an ellipse shape at the end of that. The first shading on the cylinder is just your hand direction, which is probably going to go the other way from the way mine's going. And on the rubric for the cylinder is you got to show me that you know how to shade with curves. So we want to curve our lines like this around the cylinder to show the roundness of the form. And it's a good idea to do a little bit of sharpening shading along this edge. And on the ground plane, we want to use horizontal strokes to show the flatness of the ground plane. Very basic, but these are the kinds of techniques that should be coming more naturally to you now. And that's the cylinder. A lot of this stuff is very dry and not that exciting. It's sort of like learning to play the scales on the guitar or the piano. But I hope you understand by now that these really basic techniques are fundamental for going further in art and doing more creative work. Okay, that's the cylinder. Again, you can go back to some of these if you want.
Could you explain the shadow with like the border like a cylinder and when we...
So the next one is the sphere. And sphere obviously starts with a circle. And remember, we're going to use that clock trick. This is about 10:30. This is about 4:30. That's where the shadow starts and ends. And that also implies a diameter. And from that diameter, we can determine the direction of the light, which is perpendicular. And we can use that light direction to figure out where the cast shadow has to fit. It has to fit between these two lines. And that's another ellipse, angled slightly upward because the light's obviously in front of the ball. And that's half the credit right there. That's just the shadow map. At which point you can erase the construction lines. First shading, again, you're going to be shading probably the other direction if you're right-handed. But I'm in a hurry, so I'm going to do it lefty. And here's probably the hardest part for shading on the whole exam, which is you got to show me that you can wrap these lines the direction that the ball is moving. So we're going to start with curves going this way. We're going to end with curves going this way. just passing slightly over that line. And then in the middle, the lines are going to go pretty straight as they transition from curves going one way to curves going the other way. That takes a little practice, but you'll remember it might be useful to think of what you're doing as sort of like the lines radiating around a globe, the way they get straight in the middle and then they curve towards the poles. Second shading on the ground plane is going to be horizontal again. Like this. And then we're going to observe how the reflected light on this particular photograph starts pretty close to the base. So along this edge, the ball is darker than the shadow, so we're going to darken that a little. And down here, the shadow is darker than the ball, so we're going to darken the shadow a little. And as always, somewhere in between, that edge virtually disappears. And we're going to let it sort of disappear in our drawing. And that's that. That is all you have to do for the sphere. And again, you can go back and work on these some more at the end, but we're going to go ahead to the final challenge. You'll have about an hour to do those first 4 drawings, and then you'll have about another hour to do the planar head, which is the final challenge here. I would suggest that you don't turn your paper over, just do this very small. Because I'm gonna really rush this, but I want you to have a chance to see me do it. We did this once in class, so it's not new to you, but so remember, the thing that makes it a planar head is that all the curves have been sort of transformed by the sculptor into straightish kind of lines, so that facilitates that blocking in process that I'm always talking about. So you can really think of these shapes of the eyelids, for example, in terms of these straight lines, and you don't even have to change them into curves. You can just lightly sketch the shape as straight lines. Notice these eyes are pretty wide set, so leave about 1.5 eyes in the middle. The nose is the same width as the space between the eyes, and it comes down to about halfway between the brow line and the chin, so it's going to end about there. The mouth, these proportions are on the rubric. The mouth should be 1/3 of the way down between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin, like that. The angle of the jaw should be down here below, well below the corner of the mouth. And then the eyes are going to have to end up below center because this person has this interesting either hairstyle or headpiece on, I don't know what that is on the head, but it's something. So what I recommend you do is just block in the structure like this, and then you're going to go right to the shading, shadow mapping. So I'm going to shadow map that shadow on the wall, and because all the planes are angular, you can shadow map also using these straight or straightish kind of lines. So here's what our shadow map does. So notice that almost all the shadow is just this one big piece. It's all continuous. I'm going to go ahead and first shade this before I look for the other shadow shapes. And notice also that I'm shading right over all these boundaries. When you have two shadow shapes that are next to each other, if they're adjacent, don't shade them separately, just shade that whole zone like this. And include the shadow on the wall, please. And the only other shadow shapes, which it might be helpful to kind of zoom in to see, are around this eye. And this is probably the trickiest part, because this is not, if you think of this as like, oh, how do you draw eyes, it's going to throw you off. You want to think of this in terms of what are these shadow shapes. So there's one here, and because this is a little tricky, I'm going to shade as I go. So I'm going to map that shape. This whole left side of the eyeball is in shadow. There's a little piece under the eyelid. And then there's another little piece of shadow outside of the eyelid on the right. And a little shadow actually under the eyelid that sort of makes a little jump as it crosses the other lid, like that. I'm going to go ahead and do some detail shading while I'm zoomed in here. There's a dark cast shadow under the nose and a dark core shadow where the nose turns towards the light up here. And everything else is just looking for variations within the shadow shapes that you've already found. I'm not asking for any halftone shading, so you can just leave all the white stuff white. Let's take a look at the mouth. When you're talking to yourself about what you're doing, you want to identify, like, yes, this is a cast shadow under the bottom lip. This is a form shadow above the lip. This is a form shadow on the bottom of the bottom lip, followed by a cast shadow, followed by a form shadow and a cast shadow. This eye is just formed by there's a little darkening under the lid. There's a little darkening above the lid, and a little darkening inside the eye socket. And And believe it or not, we are almost done. I'm not asking for much more than this. To give the effect that this is on a wall, we can shade a little darker right where that cast hits the wall. And notice I'm going to use some sharpening strokes to bring out this edge. And then I'm going to look for just a little more detail inside of this shadow. This would be a good chance to do some form shading, just like on a cylinder. I can kind of shade into this shadow edge. I can do the same thing up here. I can do a little shading around this side of the face. And that's where if this was a much more advanced finished study, we'd be doing form shading on every one of these features, but this is a very quick study, so we're not. I can do a little bit of form shading across this boundary here, and a little darkening inside the eye socket up here. And the last step, I said I wasn't going to do this, but if you want your drawing to look more finished, you can very, very lightly throw in some halftones. Those are areas in the light that are just getting a little bit less light. And you notice the key here is you just want to barely touch the paper, because if you press too hard on these, they're going to start to compete with your shadows, and it's going to throw off the entire drawing. So there. Obviously, I could work on this for many hours if I wanted to. Drawings are basically done when you run out of time. So I'm going to be very upset with anyone who comes for the exam and tells me they finished early, because even with all my experience, I could spend a lot longer on this drawing, and with your experience, I guarantee you that the longer you work on it, the better it's going to get. But that's all I'm going to do for now. So thanks for your attention. This is going to be posted if you want to do some more review at home.